exposure index range, you really are getting this kind of a saturation, which means we're not seeing as much as we could. We're losing that rescaling. We're losing the rescaling to all the shades of gray we can see. And now we're having less shades of gray. Even though we can see them, we're not being able to discern between two things as clearly as we could before. And so in an exposure realm, sorry, my ears just popped and it sounded really weird. I could suddenly hear myself. In the exposure, overexposure of the patient realm, you don't want to repeat something that's right outside the range because it's usually acceptable enough. You don't have as much saturation as you can see in this picture, okay? But you want to consider that once you get to that side of your range, and for some of us, that might be a high number in the exposure index scale, and for some of us, it might be a low number in the exposure index scale, indicating saturation. But you want to be aware that whatever technique you're using and making, you got a little bit more than you need, okay? And the opposite end of this scale, again, is talking about image noise and a modeled creation, a modeled type of image, and I'll show you something about that in a little bit. So I'm just going to use the example of a 100 to 400 range where over 400 is the dark end or the saturation end. In Europe, like I said, radiologists have accepted a lot of different things. First of all, they're accepting that they're shooting at longer SIDs. What the other thing they've accepted is model. They have what is called acceptable model over there. But I suspect because we don't have the same healthcare system and our physicians are opened up to more litigation than they are over in Europe, that's part of the reason that our radiologists don't buy into the wanting to read model thing. So our radiologists here in the States will say, we don't want to see any model. Model is going to degrade the image. We want to stay away from model. So on this particular scale, if 400 is saturation, anything under 100, you should start to look for that modeled appearance, that little polka dot looking image. And the midpoint of the range, if this was your range, is about 250. So when you're making your techniques, think of that as like just a back of the head, like that's where it should be. And if it's not in that range, you could be delivering a little bit too much to the patient. In this case, the lower quarter of the range is somewhere between 100 and 175. So if you're able to make your techniques in that range, you're still making an acceptable image no matter where in this range you are, but you might be doing it with less patient exposure if you're at that 100 to 175 end of the scale. So I'll talk about that specifically in a little bit. So once you have a handle on your technique, you really should make some final adjustments so that you can shoot for the lower quarter of the range. Once you start to get a base technique that's in the middle, you then can get a little cocky and say, now I can bring my dose down even more. And this is where it gets a little scary because you don't want to shoot something with model. But if you start to realize just how much change goes between each, I'm going to say we're dividing it into quarters. So each quarter, you can have control over that, and you won't be frightened and have an unexpected results. You'll know exactly how many time steps, for example, to change your mass without dropping out of that range. And these are some other examples. This is an extreme example of model, just to give you an idea. This is more or less what we might see on the image, on the radiographic image, because we'd still see the anatomy, we'd still see the detail, but it just somehow looks weird. It's like polka dot-ish. And over here, this is a digital image that has no model, and this one that they were saying has model, but I don't think it really reproduced well on my slide. And the same thing for this. This one had good pixel saturation, good pixel density or brightness, and this side didn't. And they did not show up there as well as I can see on my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, so every RT has their favorite technique. You love it because it works most of the time, right? Every now and then somebody comes and surprises you. And most of the RTs in this room will have the instinct to change that favorite technique when you look out that window and go, maybe I should go up a little, or maybe I should go down a little. Or, oh, she said, oh, I could tell by her smoking. She's got the lines. The skin is gray. I better go down, you know, if I'm doing that chest x-ray. There's a lot of instinct that we find hard to verbalize when we're teaching students or working with students that occurs in our head And students are trying to follow along, and they just see you changing techniques, and they think it's size. You know, sometimes we're thinking of terms of what's inside. Okay, so going back to that lost visual connection between what we set on the control panel and the resulting image, remember that there's a correlation now between your exposure index values and what you're setting on the control panel. This is going to help you to form techniques to lower patient dose. All right, so now we're going to talk about creating a technique chart that can be of value to us no matter what exposure, no matter what size your patient is. We're going to start with the exposure range, and from my research, I've got at least 8 manufacturers, and of those, they have 5 different ranges, 8 different calculations to achieve those range, and they're all what they call proprietary, and maybe your instructors have talked about this. Each manufacturer will not give up the trade secret of their exposure range because that's the way they're making money. That's the way they sell their product. So when we're lamenting as we have 3 or 4 jobs because one of them the saturation ends at the high, one of them is at the low, you forgot you were working there, you went up and you should have went down, that's very complicated. It doesn't sound that complicated when I say it, but when you're doing it, it is complicated and you get mixed up. And so there is an effort, and they're trying to pass a law that will make these, and when I say they, it's the American Association of Physicists and the International Electrotechnical Commission. They're trying to make manufacturers they can have their trade secrets, but they have to turn their trade secrets into this one standardized format so that we all have one range to work with. We know which end is saturation. We know which end is model. And that way we can work more efficiently and have patient exposure back in our control. Until that happens, we have to pay attention a little bit more to what we're doing. So if we get within this range, the archival properties and the features of windowing and leveling that the radiologist might want to do when they see the image are all going to work as the manufacturer intended. That's why the range is so important. It makes their equipment work like they designed it. Okay? It really doesn't have a whole lot to do with patient exposure because that's not what the manufacturer is concerned with. The manufacturer is concerned with making an x-ray that the radiologist is happy seeing. They don't care how much radiation is involved in that. And they also want to make it easy for the idiots working it. Okay? That would be us. So when they come in and talk to us, they tend to downplay. Did you ever try and ask applications guys something about technique or exposure, and they say, you don't have to worry about that. Just press this and do that and this and that. That's all you have to do, right? I see a couple of heads going, right? If you're new in the field, you might just go like, okay, they're asking a question. What do they say? I just want to know what button to push. I just want to know how to do my job. But you really have to watch those applications guys because a lot of them are not RTs that went into applications. They're salesmen. They're going to sell you equipment that you want to operate easily because that's what they do. So we need to take control and keep that radiation exposure within our realm. In the past, we memorized that statement, no amount of mass can compensate for inadequate KV. How many people know that or have heard it? Right? Everybody? I'm pretty sure everybody, right? We're still memorizing that, even though, like when I was in school, what idiot would try and do an abdomen at 40 kV? Like, have you ever seen somebody who had an inadequate amount of kV? I had to memorize that, and then I thought later as I was in clinical, why? Nobody's like, oh, I'm going to try and do this abdomen at 40 kV. No, everybody kind of uses the same sort of range. So what was so big about that thing that they made me drink the Kool-Aid on? Anyway, the new CRDR rule is no amount of window and leveling can compensate for an image that's out of the acceptable range. Okay, and that has to do with saturation, noise, archival properties of the image, and the radiologist's ability on their end at their computer station to window and level properly. Now, in the digital age, you want to reconsider model. You don't want to be that afraid of it that we are using more and more exposure. You want to be able to rethink that. And what I want to call this is extreme techniquing. You want to try and ride the lower edge of that exposure index towards model, but not out of the range. And if you make your techniques for that, especially if you notice that your favorite technique is shooting towards the saturation end, cut back in your mass a little bit And you probably will right away eliminate some dose to your patient. If you're using your old-fashioned techniques and you have a lower KV, you can raise your KV up. That's another way that you can change what you're doing so that you can deliver less dose. Again, to image gently or image lightly, you have to believe what you're hearing today about the optimal KV or the highest KV, and not believe what you're hearing from a lot of your applications guys. Listen to them about how to run the machine, get the manual and read it, and meld that with what you know about principles of exposure, because you're the one who has the knowledge, not them, and you need to know how to operate the equipment. So you want to make your techniques not at the saturation end and not out of range, obviously, at the saturation end. Those are the two danger zones, we'll call them. So don't listen to your manufacturers and use the equipment as you want to use it. Don't let I always tell the students, don't let your equipment tell you what to do. You tell the equipment what to do, okay? And so this is why we need to get involved in teaching technique a little bit more in our programs and develop a very user-friendly book. If we don't, we will be letting those manufacturers dictate what to do. So when we look at this range, we already said 250 was the middle, and saturation we'll say is at the 4 end and model is at the 1 end. And the ruler is not intended to tell you what the best technique is here today. It's just the way to start your quest for this. So if you look at this exposure index and you kind of divide it into 4, I've given the red areas as your danger zones. Under 100 on the scale is too light, or it's going to give us model or image noise. And over 400 will give you saturation. And so if you look at the green area in the middle, that's your ideal range. That's what you want to aim for, so to speak, when you're making your technique. And once you get a hang of where your base technique is, even if you stop there, you're going to have more control over what you're doing, and you're going to see a visual result of the size of the person and what your image is. The yellow end of the range is okay to shoot at because it's still the acceptable range. But if you're at this end, your technique is probably a less patient exposure than if you're at this end. So you might want to think about cutting back a little bit because you're still going to be in the acceptable range. And again, just a different way of expressing it, same thing. You're acceptable, but you have higher exposure factors at this end, and you're not acceptable down at this end because you're going to, you are acceptable because you're going to be giving less patient exposure. So let's look at the fixed KV system. All right. In the fixed KV system, we're going to say there's an optimal KV, and what we're going to do is decide that we're going to make all of our mass changes for part size. And the step-by-step approach that we're going to take, I have a lab handout that I'm going to give to the faculty here at the college, but I can also email it to anybody, the technologists who want it. And my email will be at the end of the slide, so if you want something like that, you can write my email down and ask me for it, and I'll send it to you. It goes through this, what we're going to go through now, step by step. So the fixed KV system is going to say that you need a maximum KV for the part. You need to know how you're doing the exam. Is it tabletop? Is it grid? Is it SID? And what room, not necessarily room 1, room 3, but you got to know if you have a 3-phase or a single phase or equipment changes like that, generator changes do make a difference. And once you have those parameters set, you're going to start by fixing your base technique so you're shooting at higher KVs for the optimal digital systems. So once you have your KV, you're going to use your basic 15% rule. And in school, we needed to know precisely what 15% of the KV was because you have multiple choice answers and you need to pick one. But a rule of thumb has been, and I'm sure this isn't new, that if you half your mass, you can go up 10 kV. And if you double your mass, you go down 10 kV. So if you're bringing your KV up somewhat, you can cut your mass back. And that's what I'm suggesting you start out doing with your favorite technique so you can use the optimal KVs. If you come away with nothing else today but that, you'll have delivered lower patient dosage tomorrow or Monday than you did on Friday. All right, so if you're using something like 75 kV and the optimal is 80, instead of halving and doubling your mass, you can do the quarter, go up or down a quarter of the mass. All right, so we start out with saying, like, maybe you had 70 kV for your abdomens, and now we're going to try and make an 80 kV abdomen technique chart. These are pages from this lab activity that the students do. And what I've done here is they've started their centimeter ranges at 40, only because, nothing scientific, the caliper doesn't go any higher than 40, right? So they start at 40, they go down 2 centimeters at a time, and what this yellow highlighted area is, I have the students measure their own body parts. Because if you take a person in to do an x-ray, they think we're chatting with them, but what we're doing is sizing them up. Can they get on the table? Can they move? What do they got on? What am I going to use? Are they bigger than me? Holy mackerel, they're bigger than me. Oh my God. Look at this little skinny thing, right? Did any of you students get a technique from somebody and they say they're big? Okay? If I said to you they're big, they're really big, right? If someone 5 feet tall and 98 pounds said they're big, what do you mean? Like the whole world is bigger than that person, right? So sometimes when you're getting your techniques from your technologists, they know what they mean by big. So we tell the students, measure yourself, and you know that every time you're going to do a case, you start out by setting that measurement up. And you set that on the control panel. You go out, you meet your patient, and then you say to yourself, well, I know I'm going to need more than that or less than that, okay? And for technologists, you only need that one measurement of yourself in your technique book. This is a technique book for students who are getting used to what people look like, what their sizes are, how much am I changing, what is the stuff that we already know by trial and error. If, as a technologist, all I have is an address book. A is for abdomen, C is for chest, right? Zygoma, C. And I have my centimeter range, my centimeter number for the part, and I have a mass and a KV and how I did it. Whether it was a grid, 12-to-1 grid, or an 8-to-1 grid, because now we have all those crazy portable grids that are like 5-to-1 and whatnot. Screws us totally up with our grid from the table. That's 12-to-1, right? So when you go on a portable, you're like, oh, God, now what do I use? Don't tell me I have to do that formula. What's the grid ratio factor? That's where we love having students, right? What's the grid factor for 12? Quick. I knew that. I was just testing you. Okay. Right? So what you want to do, students, is have that, and then that's your base technique. And believe it or not, once we get this base technique, if we use it on that size person and it results in the exposure index value that we anticipated, let's say the middle of the range in my example was 250. Let's say it comes out at 250. You can go, oh, that's great. I'm going to shoot for the middle of the range because I'm a student and unexpected things happen, collimation and whatnot. I'm going to make my whole page that way. So then we'll talk about how you fill this in and how you make all these other techniques. This is the exposure index value that this particular student got when she did this technique. It also tells you that this one technique is tried and true. I used it on somebody, I used it on a real situation, it came out. And we know that the rest of these are extrapolated, because we might need to tweak things later on. But once you do one person, that's all you need. Now you can do everybody. You can change your mass for all the part size. Okay, so again, keep it simple. If you're the type like me, when I learned something at 82 kV. It's killing me to go to 80. But guess what? Doesn't matter. Just go to 80. Because if, as a student especially, it's so much easier to say 80 kV for this, 90 kV for that, 60 kV for this, 70 kV for that, instead of 83, 82, 81. I work with him. He likes 86. It's crazy, because then you really don't get an understanding of technique. You just get an understanding of what all the technologists you're working with like, right? So my keep it simple is to try and do your techniques by 10s, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. For those like me, you're old dogs, you have a hard time learning new tricks, you could go by 5s. It won't kill you, right? So it's just faster and easier to set. 80, 90, 60, you know, you don't have to go that minor thing that you're going 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, a little bit faster. Okay, so this is some of the exposure index ranges in our program alone. And so again, no matter what they call this, they might call this 50 to 150, 1700 to 2000. I'm working with the 1.9 to 205 right now. It could be apples and oranges, who cares? It's a 1 to 4 range, divided into quarters, okay? And shoot for the middle or the lower half and not the saturation half. Shooting for the middle. Each RT will have a vision of what their technique book should look like. Again, I just use a phone book, a little tiny one that can go in my pocket. And after a while, you know what your base technique is. Just like you do today, have your favorite technique, you'll now have a standard technique that you'll eventually get to know and love, and that'll be your new favorite technique. And from that, you're going to be able to adjust for different measurement sizes without doing any math. You're going to just know, because I'm going to tell you how to make those adjustments. For students, I will send something to your instructors. If they like it, maybe they'll do that. Or maybe they'll have you just use a phone book system, okay? Or maybe you'll just have a spiral page thing. I love the little tab things you can get from Staples now, and they hook onto the page, and then you can change them without it ripping up your pages. I love that. It makes me find things a lot easier because they're big too. I can see them. I can't see anything anymore. There are programs out there that will calculate a technique chart for you, but you don't need to spend your money on something like that. We're all capable of doing this. And once you do it once, you don't have to do any more calculations. You can sit down and calculate a whole technique book for every possible scenario, and you will be the best portable radiographer that there is. When I was in school, we would get a lot of phone calls about doing something portable, and this was our response. Oh, no, we don't do that portable. What are they, nuts? Now, really, seriously, everything can be done portable. It's an x-ray machine. Some patients don't lend themselves to portable because they're a little out of the parameters and a little out of the unusual, a little unusual. But you can't make a judgment by an exam and say, we don't do that exam portable. Okay, because you should be able to. What frightens us about portable, if we have been using AEC for years, is we haven't a clue on what to use because it's not photo timing. Unless you have these new Gizmo portables, which I think are fabulous too, that you can photo time it and the image comes up right away, and you can, those are nice portables, right? That's like, to me, the Lamborghini of portables. I can't wait to work someplace where I can actually touch one of those. Anyway, you should be able to say, okay, I'm taking that 8 to 1 grid or 6 to 1 grid or 5 to 1 grid, and I'm going to use this because I have a page in my book for it. And then you go up and you're the best person on the world. You can teach your students. They really know that they really can spot the people who are rising to the top. The students know there's no wool pulled over their eyes. All right. So one of the things I can tell you about using this technique book kind of approach to CR and DR is that no matter which 11 sites that I go to, it can be a junior student that started in January, and we're in April now. If that student has a technique in their book, I just step right back. Junior student, 10 days into the field, I know their technique's going to work. It's going to be in that range. Might not be where I want it to be in that range, but it's going to be in that range. Because first of all, they're not taking any techniques from texts that are bad. We don't give them bad techniques. We give them good techniques. And if they change the KV to where we want it and they do all this math, it's going to come out right. And I no longer have to say to students, why didn't you know a technique? Or why didn't that come out? Or you didn't set the right technique? Or that's too light? Or that's too dark? All of that has been eliminated, and the student focuses more on positioning and centering, which I would really like to see happen. It's less of a variable. Technique should not be something we have to think about. It's now automatic. It's numbers. It's not somebody staring over your shoulder saying, I feel the image is too dark. I think the image is too light. There's a number. It's in front of you. It's concrete. You can't argue against it, which is probably also the downside. right? Because we always want to get a point here and there when we're testing. But when you have numbers, the numbers don't lie. Okay, so like I said, we'll start out by writing all the important parameters so that you know how that exam was done. And then what you're going to do is collect your optimal KVs. In this case, it's an abdomen at 80. You're going to set up your centimeters on the page. This is page 1 of 2, and this one happens to be by 1 centimeter. And the reason I put it up there is because even though in class you could calculate mass in here, you can't always set it on the control panel. So what I'm going to introduce to you here is that for every 2 centimeters, we're going to change our mass. And then you can set that on the control panel. But when we test you in school, sometimes we'll say, like, you know, okay, we want to know what mass would you use in between here and here. So now we've got our centimeters set up in 2s. We've got our highlighted for who we are. And what we're going to do now is take a look at how to compare exams that are done similarly, such as an abdomen and a pelvis. All right, if you noticed before, I said that they have 3 techniques and they extrapolate everything else from there. And this is one of the ways they do that. If you've got an exam that's done exactly the same way, the only difference between an abdomen and a pelvis is that, crosswise, lengthwise, right? And so you can set the same technique. There's no reason to change it anymore because you're still using the optimal KV of 80. And so it's easy to calculate a new page for that. The other thing you might want to do is think about grid use for extremities. And I believe my colleague will talk a little bit differently about this later. And I just wanted to say that because my lecture is about reducing exposure, I'm going to introduce the concept of doing things tabletop that maybe we're not used to doing tabletop. And one of these is shoulder, all right? So they're telling us to increase our KV to 70, okay, from 60. And 60 was the cutoff because after that you need a grid, or after 10 centimeters you need a grid, right? But there is a lot better response from the IRs now with this higher KV. On the left here, image A, is a film screen shoulder. Those technologists that have dealt with film screen always know about the shoulder and the AC joint burning out and what can you do. Maybe a compensating filter. Oh yeah, well that you're lucky if you could find one of those. No one ever purchased those. Oh well, I get fancy. I put a little lead strip up there. Oh okay, that's great, right? But those are all the things you had to do to get that AC joint back. But that's what your film screen Bucky grid shoulder looked like. This is what your new what your CR/DR shoulders look like. We've gotten our AC joint back. We're all happy about that, us old dogs, because we're like, wow, I could never get that to show up when I was doing a shoulder before. Now I can see my AC joints. That's great. And this one is a tabletop shoulder. So with rescaling, again, contrast is not controlled by KV anymore. It's by the algorithms in the equipment. So we can do a patient's shoulder tabletop. And when we do that, as opposed to doing it in the 12-to-1 Bucky, we're cutting back and using about 1/5 of the mass, right? Because your 12-to-1 grid factor is 5. So I would be using 5 times the mass on the table than I was doing tabletop. Now, the reason I've come to that conclusion is I just said before I work nights. And nights is all about stretcher patients. And stretcher patients, now with CR/DR, our viewers and readers are not in the same room as the patient. So I need to leave them and go and look at a thing. And I have about 50 other computers that I have to do stuff to check them in, to say I started the case, to type their history in, to then send it to PACS. I'm like back there in secretarial world on a moving chair going like computer to computer. And the patient's alone in the room. I stopped moving people onto the table years ago. I do everything on the stretcher that I can because they have side rails when I leave, right? I just didn't want to be written up. It just sounds so bad when they write that on the, yeah, and then I left the room, and then they fell on the floor. What were they here for? They fell down the stairs, at home, they fell in the bathroom. You know, it just never sounded right to me, and I never wanted to appear that way on an incident report. So I started doing everything on the stretcher. And if you know anything about doing stuff on the stretcher or the bed, that grid is a PIA, especially in digital world. I don't care if you're still using a 5-to-1 grid. It's sinking somewhere, and it's not quite flat, and blah, blah, blah. And I am a little bit of a digital nerd. I'm really old-fashioned, and I can't really work this correctly to make a phone call. But I did download an app that is a protractor, an angulator. So now when I do my grid thing, I do this, and then I do this to the tube, and I get it to align perfectly. I am a nerd. But that wasn't really doing it for me because it took too much time. I'm still an old dog, and it's all about get them in, get them on, get them up, right? So I started to say, like, well, what would happen if I just did this non-grid? It's a little old lady. She's skinny. I'm going to try it. And it came out nice. I said, okay. Next person, I was like, well, she's a little bit bigger than the last lady. I'll just compensate for her size and try that again. Oh, that came out. And now I'm doing young guys, football injuries, AC joint separation, 72 inches, like we used to do a chest x-ray. Remember that? And shoulders would show up at 70 kV. All right? So a little bit of that Sankofa stuff where I got to go backwards to progress forwards. So we can reduce our patient exposure. Hips, femurs, and shoulders in particular, what I'm talking about, that now can be done tabletop. If you're annoyed by your grids, you can try that. You're still using the optimal kV, so you're using a lower mass, and you're not using all the mass that's required of a table bucky type of thing. We kind of had this sense of this when we do children, the baby gram thing, from mouth to anus for foreign body. Anybody who's doing that bucky, way too much exposure for a child. All they want to know is, do they have a toy truck in their gut? You know? Or mommy's earring was the last one I did. She ate my earring. And yes, there it was. All right, so we don't need that detail. We don't need that kind of exposure. We can do that tabletop. So you should have a page in your technique book for that too. So you're starting out with one great technique, and you're going to extrapolate from there. And how to extrapolate from there is you're going to go up a step, and I know that I just made instructors cringe too. Go up a step on the control panel for every 2 centimeters larger, and go down a step on the control panel for every 2 centimeters smaller. So what I always do wherever I work is I write down the MA stations that we have available to me that work. Now, I used to have 800 here, but that doesn't work anymore because I think I used it too much. And the time stations are here, and I calculate out the mass. And so if I'm setting up a technique, I know that I can still use 200 MA station for a small focal spot for extremities, so that's usually what I'm using, so I have a shorter time. It took me a long time to do that, and it felt like I was writing with my left hand to not use 100 on an extremity, because that's what I've always done for 30 years. But now I use 200 because I can have a shorter exposure time. And that's great, right? And this is your time station. So for every step down, you are changing your mass. And so these numbers on this column here become those numbers on this. So once you have one good technique that you've tried, you extrapolate that page for bigger or smaller by doing just what I said here. And this is the way to do it on this. This control panel is easy enough. You can see your time stations, right? But on this kind of a control panel, you can go up or down here, and it'll give you the answer. It calculates. It does this chart for you. In other words, it's automatic. So you can go up and down. But you have to watch your MA station that you're selecting. At this 320 MA station on this equipment, it's still a small focal spot. But you will have trouble trying to go up past 80 or even 80 kV on some masses that you set because of the small focal spot. So you want to look at that. And if you're doing stuff like abdomen, you want to make sure you're switched over to like the 320 large focal spot so that you can shoot at that higher kV. Otherwise, it won't let you. Okay. So We're looking at things that we know are similar, AP abdomen, AP pelvis, I already gave you as an example. AP forearm, AP elbow, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We all know that a grid knee and a grid shoulder are sort of the same thing, and a tabletop knee and a tabletop shoulder are also sort of the same thing. So you can fill in a lot of pages in your book just by saying, even on the top, it could say abdomen and pelvis. This is what you do. And then you have one less page in your book, okay? So if you have the same body part and it's done differently, like I said before, sometimes it's a grid thing, but for me, it's a distance thing. I already told you that I tend to want to shoot a longer SID, and one of my earliest discoveries was upright abdomens when I was trying to pass that comp. How many of us would consider doing a man's chest x-ray lengthwise right off the bat? Okay, good, we're all on the same page. Some of us might say, I can do it, right? Maybe bring your distance back. Most of us will do a crosswise chest, right? Because they're broader. Makes sense. I'm into that. Heavier woman, also. Not going to have long lungs, got too much gut in the way. We could do that crosswise too, maybe. All right? But the point of it is, at 72 inches, you're doing a man's chest x-ray crosswise. And then when you go to do his abdomen, do you bring it into 40, 48, 42, 40-something? Nope. Good. I like that. Some people said no. And that's true. Why bring that in to 40 inches if you know they don't fit lengthwise on there to begin with, right? The men's chests don't fit lengthwise, so we want to make sure we keep that distance so we can have as much reduction in magnification as possible for our abdomens. Again, shooting in a longer SID is going to give less patient exposure. So maybe you want to change your abdomen from a 40-inch abdomen to a 72-inch upright. Or maybe you do them 48-inch supine and 72-inch upright. But the idea is you should have a page for each of your distances. And I know in one of my rooms, our upright bucky also is a different grid ratio than the one in the table. So that presents a challenge because you have to change it for that grid ratio as well. All right? So, you know, just think about that a little bit. You can see you have all the both arch of the diaphragm. If they centered properly, that would be on. As opposed to somebody who's maybe filling up at 40 inches and not going to have the full arch of the diaphragm. So when you change your abdomen from 40 to 72, you can sit down and do your mass density maintenance formula. But those of us technologists, we don't like all that multiplication and cross-multiplying. Forget cross-multiplying. This chart here can easily be incorporated into your technique book too. You can say that if your original SID was 44, and now you want to shoot that at 72, you multiply your original mass by 2.6, 2.68, 2.7. So you got one handy thing to multiply by. You don't have to do cross-multiplying, reducing fractions, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you have to do that for your registry, but you don't, have to do that. Okay, so that's a handy chart to have, and it's easier to change your mass. For example, if you're shooting at 40 and then you want to do 48, or you're doing 72-inch chest and you want to do 80, you can multiply your original mass by 1.5. It's a real easy way of just lengthening your SID. And portable radiography is nothing like going a little bit longer and knowing everything's on, Go long. I feel like I just said a football thing. All right. If you knew me, you'd know that was very ironic. Again, if RTs are working with students, they can give real-life scenarios like this to the student to practice these kinds of formulas and know that they make sense. The grid ratio formulas given in school, like we see here, can be used to fill in, once you have a good AP abdomen at 40 inches at 12-to-1 grid, maybe your portable grid is 8-to-1. So you can have them make up a whole page of 8-to-1. Once you find that one technique, thousands of pages can come of that. You can think of all different ways that I could do an abdomen and fill in a million different pages. And then you never have to do math again. And that's my goal in life. I can only say I wish it was true for my bank statements. But unfortunately, have to do some math. Okay, so now we'll go back to that discussion about lumbar spines and density. And we know that collimation eliminates photons. And because we now have less photons, there's less density, right? So if we start out with an abdomen technique and we go to an AP lumbar spine, we know we have to go up a little. I learned that through that little experience with the lady doing her hair. And I realized what it is. But I started to think in terms of square footage, or in this case in radiography, square inches. And so if you had a 14 by 17 IR, you have approximately 238 square inches of photons in there. So I'm just going to say, let's pretend that for every little square inch you got one photon. And most of them are going to be 80 keV photons, right? But there's going to be some in there that are less and some in there that are more. And then we're going to now do a lumbar spine on the same person. And we're going to collimate to 8 inches across. Well, we just changed our field size from 238 to 136 square inches. And if you relate to it in terms of that, you can almost see how many photons we eliminated. Okay, and this is pretend worlds because I don't know exactly how many photons come out of a beam. But if you go from 238 to 136, you roughly have to double your mass to get the same number of photons that was here now in this space. Okay, we're not squishing them in, because you can't focus photons, right? We've eliminated so many, so now we don't have that density. We now want to put all those that we eliminated back in this place. So you make twice the mass, twice the number of photons, and you'll get the same density as your AP lumbar spine. Okay, and the same thing goes for your lateral. In the old days, we had to do that go up KV thing because we couldn't create any more photons. We were at our maximum MA station, we're at our maximum time. But now you can, because if you go from your 17 by 8, which again is 136 photons, to 8 by 8, and I forget what I said 8 by 8 was. Oh, 8/8 are 64, sorry. You're going to see that that's roughly how much you go up. And in the old days, double your mass is like 10 kV. So you can either go up to 10 kV or you can double your mass, whichever you want. Both will work. We don't longer need to think about, well, I'm doing this because I need to penetrate. You're doing it because you changed IR size and you don't have as many photons anymore. Okay? Same body part, less photons, less density. Okay? This was the example I just gave to you. So. All right, so when you're extrapolating, you're going to use your lumbar spine technique, and you can do something else that they taught us in school. For every 5 centimeters, you can double your mass. So you can fill in your chart that way, too. I noticed a lot of people who have lumbar spine issues are sort of round. And when I was taught in school, they always said, well, your AP, you're so much smaller. Well, I guess everybody was like model thin, you know, and that's true. But nowadays, people who have back issues are usually a little heavier. They're a little rounder. And so they're not necessarily a whole different mass that we need. They can almost be imaged with the same KV, and well, they can be imaged with the same KV, but just a little change in mass for part size. And so that's what we're thinking about in terms of going from an AP to a lateral. But then we're thinking about how much photons we eliminate when we now go to that little spot film. So you can use this fixed KV system very effectively. You can either image all of your spines at 90 for every view, and then you get a better sense of, when I change mass, what's happening in my exposure index on the resulting image. It's easier to keep track of, and we call it building a mental film library. So you can change a mass on the control panel, and you can predict what number is going to come out on that thing. My students are doing it, they're making up their technique charts. They like to make bets with each other. I bet it's going to be this number. I bet it's going to be that number. It's like a little game they play. I don't know what it is about students, but they're so competitive. If they're not competing about, what'd you get in lab? What'd you get in this? What'd you get in that? Did you get this right? Now they're competing to see who can predict the exposure index values that are coming out. Like, good for you. Okay, so one good technique, you identify your size, you're now going to go out there, you've got everything extrapolated, you've got everything in your book, you're going to work with it a little bit, and you're going to see what comes out and what you might need to tweak and what you might need not to. I'm telling you, if you get to the beginning part of this where you get a good technique and extrapolate it, you won't even have to do the rest of this because it will all fall into the exposure index range. You'll have more control over it, and everybody's lumbar spine will be at that exposure index value because you're going to make it be that. Whatever one that you pick as like, that's my target. And you'll be able to shoot much more consistently across patient sizes and types. And the radiologist will be happy. You'll be using the equipment like it's supposed to. You'll be using the optimal KV, so you'll be giving less exposure. And you'll have one less thing to worry about. That mysterious, I don't know, do you think it'll come out? One of the things that I have here on this slide is what we use. Well, we're using netbooks now to grade our students. So this paper form is now on a netbook. And so we go in, we have this little netbook, we type it away. They say they can't stand it because all they hear me doing is this, and they're like, oh my God, I'm doing something wrong. I said, no, I was like, oh, identify the patient, you were really nice, blah, blah. It's like, why do you always assume? If you're doing something wrong, I have a lot less to say. All right, so on our first part of our test, this is the cover. The first part is all about what you've done, what you did for patient care, what you did for radiation protection, how you position the meat and potatoes of everything. The last page is the image evaluation page, and each view can get written at the top here. And then what we have is the section up here is positioning, and then we have detail and distortion, which includes, did you angle the right way? Did you center in the right place? Did you have the part in the middle of the IR? The third part is radiation protection. Do I see 4 borders of collimation? If you use shielding that could have shown up in the image, is it visible on the image but not obscuring detail that is supposed to be there? And then the bottom half of this was what we used for film screen, and that was density and contrast. Okay? And so students could get a 3, which means like, oh my God, wow. That something went on that was like so fabulous. I'm like impressed. I would have done that after 35 years. It's great. 2 is where we expect you to be. That's great. You did good. Everything met, minimum expectations. 1, something was not quite right. We needed a little bit of improvement. Usually there's comments that are going along with a grade of 1. And 0 just means it either never happened or it happened really incorrectly. Okay, so once we get down to this area, the way that we're grading students now is by using that scale. Anything out the ends, you're getting a 0 for density and contrast because you should have been working on your technique book to be in that range somewhere, okay? And what we're giving a 3 on is we've made the range, and I'm telling you to divide things in quarters. We actually made our range from the center downwards a little bit. So our students are trying to make their techniques in the center, but sort of down below dead center. And that way they're still within that middle of the acceptable range from the manufacturer in case something unexpected happens. But we're trying to get them to drink the Kool-Aid on shooting a little lighter, imaging gently, imaging lighter. And then the 1s and the 2s follow that. We don't give a 1 for the lower exposure. It goes 3, 2, and then 0. And for the higher exposure, we go 3, 2, 1 to say, like, all right, you need to do something because you're approaching saturation and the bad end of the range. Bring it back a little bit. So that's the way we test our students. But I got to say, in doing this, and these are all the different ranges that we have in our sites. This is the one that no, that's not the one I'm using. But anyway, what we say is here's the numbers that the students will earn based on which exposure index value that they got. And all the CIs do is they cut this out and put it right on the viewer, and we all look at it when we're looking at images. I got to say that the technical staff as well look at this now. And we say, this is where I work, 2.12 to 2.24 is the most ideal place that's dead center. And the dead center number that the students wanted to know because they want to be that precise is 2.18. When they can get it on 2.18, they're all like high-fiving and getting all excited and whatnot. But the technologists are also looking at that. And they now have gained back that visual connection between what they're setting on the control panel and what they're delivering to the patient and what's going on. And they're seeing what the changes are that they're making at the control panel. And so even though this is a student thing and it has to do with school and whatnot, I think it's made me a better technologist. I know that I feel like I'm delivering a little bit less dose to my patients, and hopefully you'll feel the same way and start to rethink your techniques. Like I said, I'm not here to give you a great technique today. That's up to you. We all know that we can set our own techniques. We all do it right now. I have my favorite technique, somebody else. Poor students are going around. That picture of the person gathering the flowers, I always say to the staff, at the beginning our students are wandering through the field, picking up anything that looks, oh, this is pretty, this is pretty. They have no idea. I'm just collecting a big bouquet of numbers, and I have these numbers. And we need to make those numbers real. And it's harder to make those numbers real when we're all using something different, okay? So I just wanted to say I hope you bring home something today that will help you to think in terms of ALARA in the digital age and think in terms of using a higher KV that maybe you're comfortable with today. And this is my email address. big long last name. A lab sheet, an optimal KV list. I have a diagram that tells you which cells you should use for phototiming. And I do have an article that if you email me, I'm going to send you anyway, about how to do ribs in the new millennium so that you can do 2 exposures and let go of that lowers image that you might have still be doing. And that's another way of getting rid of 1 additional exposure. You can, if you're seeing all 12 ribs on the oblique, you can do that for the AP as well, believe it or not. There's a trick. And so I can give you that as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know I've enjoyed speaking with you today, and I'll see you later. Oh, there's more handouts in the back. Anybody who did not get a handout, they have extra handouts in the back for anybody who didn't get a handout. Thank you. All right, I hid my water, and I'll take my Rico.